A few years back, some friends of mine purchased a massive stretch of remote land in southern Colorado, deep in the San Luis Valley. It was the kind of place you only hear about through word of mouth, wide open, wild, and unsettlingly quiet. They had big plans, greenhouses, self-sustaining farming, maybe even a retreat. But before any of that could happen, the land had to be cleared. I volunteered to help and ended up spending a solid month out there, working to clear 10 acres of a heavily wooded area. There wasn't any infrastructure yet. No electricity, no plumbing, not even a foundation. So I lived in a tent, surrounded by trees and miles of isolation. The silence was notable. At night, it seemed to press against the walls of my tent like a fog. One night, after a long day of clearing brush, I walked over to this overlook on the edge of the property. It was something I'd gotten into the habit of doing, just sitting quietly before bed, looking down over the canyon below. There was something peaceful about it, but that night something happened. As I sat there, everything around me lit up in a brilliant, blinding flash. The entire canyon was suddenly aglow, white hot, and wide like a lightning strike. But there was no sound. No thunder, no wind, just a burst of light, so fast and intense it almost didn't seem real. And then, in a single instant, it was all gone. My mind scrambled for explanations, like something exploded, or someone was illegally lighting fireworks, but there was no sign of fire, no sound of engines, and no one for miles. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was strange but harmless. I walked back to my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and forced myself to sleep. A few days later, I ran into a local rancher who lived some odd miles down the dirt road. We chatted for a while, and I casually brought up the flash of light. His expression instantly shifted. His eyes narrowed, and he asked what night I'd seen it. I told him, and his answer still chills me. That same morning, he had found 3 of his cows dead in the very canyon below my overlook. They were all lying together, not scattered like they had panicked. The sight he described was chilling. All 3 of them completely drained of blood. No signs of any foul play, of an attack. No tire tracks, no footprints. Just clean, precise damage, as if the animals had just been simply placed there. He said it wasn't the first time something awful like that happened out there. Let me be clear, this wasn't just remote. This was in the middle of nowhere. To get to the nearest store was about 30 to 40 minutes. There were no streetlights, no cell service, no neighbors, and yet someone, had done that in the night without leaving a single trace. After that conversation, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside the tent made my skin crawl. I kept a hatchet next to my sleeping bag and began sleeping in waves, lightly, uneasily, waiting for something to brush the side of the canvas. And it wasn't just that one event. There were also strange noises at night, sometimes metallic humming, distant thuds like something heavy landing far off in the woods. Something about that valley began to feel wrong. Not haunted exactly, but odd. Like the land was aware of you and not particularly welcoming. I've always considered myself grounded, rational, even skeptical when it comes to anything paranormal. But after spending a month way out in the San Luis Valley, I'm not as certain as I used to be. There are too many unknowns in this world. When I was a kid, I lived on a small property tucked deep in the woods. The house itself had been built around the skeleton of an old stable, repurposed, renovated, but never quite cleansed of whatever history it carried. My bedroom had once been the hayloft, where fresh bales were stacked high for the horses that used to be kept there. It was a quiet place most of the time, surrounded by trees with a wide garden clearing that let in just enough sunlight during the day and just enough darkness at night. But before I continue on, there are a few things you should know. For starters, every now and then my room would suddenly smell like hay. Not faintly either. It was strong, like freshly cut hay, the scent thick and earthy. This would happen even in the dead of winter, when nothing was growing outside. There were no horses anymore, no stored bales, no need for them. It would just be me lying awake and wondering why the air felt heavier when that scent rolled in. Then there was my dog. He refused, absolutely refused to go upstairs. Every time I tried coaxing him up, he'd plant his feet, ears flat, tail low, sometimes even growling at the stairs like something was waiting for him at the top. Sometimes he would just stand at the bottom and just stare. No barking, no anything. Just watching, as if guarding. Or maybe seeing something I didn't. And then the knocking. There were these 3 exterior doors to our house, spaced out across the front, back, and side. At random times we'd hear knocking, sometimes soft, sometimes loud. But the worst nights were when all 3 were knocked on at once. I would freeze in place every time. My parents always said it was the wind or the old pipes, but deep down, I knew. You just can't quite mistake the rhythm of a knock. Still, I managed to live with those strange occurrences for a while. I learned to pretend they didn't bother me, until one particular night, when everything changed. My room had a large window overlooking the garden, and behind it were the dense woods beyond. It gave a breathtaking view during the day, but at night it was crazy how that same picturesque view turned into a vast, eerie void of dark. One evening I was lying in bed, just staring out past the glass, unable to sleep. The house was still. The only sound was the creaking of the old frame settling into the cold. And then out of nowhere, I heard a child's laugh. It was light, playful and close. It came from upstairs, from my floor. I shot upright, my heart racing. I wasn't expecting to hear anything, let alone that. I didn't have siblings. No one else should have been on that floor but me. I had been fixated on the doorway for several minutes, and it wasn't until I turned back around that I noticed my window. The massive bedroom window was now wide open. It had been closed and latched tight before bed, but now I was staring at the open glass as it let in the cold night air, the curtains fluttering like something had just passed through. I rushed over, half expecting to see something just standing there, but all I caught was a quick flicker of movement, something small darting out into the trees way beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out much other than a shape, a child-sized silhouette vanishing into the dark. I didn't sleep that night, and honestly, many nights for the 2 years that followed were restless. Every creak, every knock, every sudden draft made my skin crawl. I never saw that figure again, but that feeling of being watched never left. The air in that house was always heavy, like the past refused to stay buried. Sometimes I wondered if that laughter had been real at all, or if the house had simply soaked up too much of what once was. When we finally moved, I didn't say goodbye. I didn't even look back. And even now, when the warmer seasons roll back around, I always hesitate to open my windows. My longtime friend Kate and I have always liked exploring places most people don't bother with. We hike often, especially in parts of the Pacific Northwest that feel untouched. But around Forks, there are endless trails and backwood routes where it's easy to feel completely alone, and that's exactly what we look for. Over the years, we've come across our share of odd things. Old fences that don't seem to have a purpose, collapsed structures, rusted out tools half buried in moss. We've found objects like old antique glass bottles, cigarette tins, jewelry. We even found a couple rolls of undeveloped film. We were maybe 5 miles into a lesser-known trail when we saw a roof line through the trees. At first, it looked like just another outbuilding or shed, but once we stepped off the trail, we realized it was a house. 2 stories, small but solid, tucked away far enough that you'd never know it was there unless you wandered. The front steps were soft and half collapsed. The door was already cracked open. Inside, the air smelled like old fabric and dust. It was clear the place had been abandoned for a long time, but everything inside still looked somewhat intact, like whoever had left hadn't taken much with them. There was a couch in the center of the room, sagging in the middle, a toppled-over wooden coffee table with one splintered leg, a sideboard with some dishes still stacked neatly on top. On the floor not too far from the fireplace was a vintage clown doll. To spite some other clutter, I noticed it immediately because I knew Kate would give me a priceless reaction. She never understood the appeal of clowns. Personally, neither did I. And in my own opinion, I always found the antique versions to be the creepiest. But Kate's dislike and, dare I say, fear for these clowns was far more intense than mine. But it was the comments she made that always made me laugh. I cautiously plucked it up from the floor as I drew her attention to it. Her reaction was instant, equal parts disgust and mockery, and exactly what I expected. Even in a place like that, with the air already heavy and strange, we found a second of normalcy in her sarcastic remarks. I placed it back and we continued. The rest of the house wasn't much, just a kitchen with an old ceramic sink, 2 bedrooms upstairs and a narrow hallway. One of the bedrooms had a mattress on the floor with no sheets, just a crumpled blanket and a pillow that had gone flat. The other bedroom was empty except for a chair, and places where it looked like the roof had started falling. It wasn't until I passed the hallway window again that I noticed how dark it had gotten outside. The sky was already a deep gray blue, and the tree line looked almost black through the glass. Time had definitely gotten away from us. We moved toward the stairs to head back down, and that's when we saw the vintage clown. It was right before the top of the staircase, in the exact path we had to go. It was sitting upright, facing us. There was no doubt I had left it downstairs, right by the fireplace where I first found it. We hadn't been split up at all, and there was no indication of anyone else being in that house. Even so, those floors would creak, even if a mouse ran over them. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Normally, Kate would have been quick to blame this on me trying to scare her, but the look on her face told me she was genuinely frightened. Neither of us waited to think about it. We made our way out, and we made our way out fast. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack before we even set foot outside. The trail back felt longer than it should have. We were rambling about it almost the whole way back, in between our heaving lungs while we focused on moving fast and watching our footing. By the time we saw the trailhead sign again, it felt like we reached a safe zone. I waited until we got to the car to tell Kate the crazy sensation I felt right before we ran from the house. And if you've ever been caught out in a lightning storm, you'll know exactly what I mean. That fuzzy feeling of static almost crawling over your skin, like pins and needles before lightning strikes close. Although that day was sunny and warm, it was practically perfect. I was going to disregard it as a sudden flood of adrenaline, until Kate looked at me, all the color draining from her skin, and told me she felt it too. We never added that location to the trail log as one to revisit. We only marked it as a place of the forest we now knew to avoid. and we haven't returned since.